Welcome back, you unstoppable force of nature, resilient, relentless, and impossible to break. Take a breath. Not because you're falling apart, but because something has finally clicked into place. Something you were never supposed to hear has surfaced, quietly, almost accidentally, and now the last 5 years are rearranging themselves in your mind. Not collapsing, reordering. Like furniture finally being put back where it always belonged. Someone broke the silence. Not with drama, not with a confrontation, just enough truth slipped through for everything to make sense. And the moment it did, you realized something unsettling you always knew. Not consciously, not in a way you could explain, but there was a low-level distortion you lived with, a subtle wrongness beneath conversations. The way energy shifted after you left a room. The way smiles lingered just a second too long. The way warmth cooled without explanation. You noticed it, and then immediately told yourself you were imagining things. You chose generosity over suspicion. You chose benefit of the doubt over pattern recognition. You chose to believe that if something was wrong, someone would say it to your face. That assumption was your only mistake. Because behind your back, there were conversations you were never meant to hear. Not isolated moments, not misunderstandings, coordinated narratives. Repeated discussions where your name stopped being attached to a human being and became a subject instead. Where your intentions were interpreted without you present. Where your reactions were summarized without context. Where your silence was edited, reframed, and repurposed into whatever version made other people most comfortable. And the most disturbing part isn't that it happened. It's how normal it was for them. It didn't begin with cruelty. It never does. It started as concern. As just trying to understand, as quiet check-ins that pretended to be innocent. I don't know how to say this, but slowly, subtly, concern hardened into agreement. Agreement turned into certainty. Certainty became permission. Someone finally admitted it, not because you demanded answers, not because you exposed anyone, but because guilt, when carried long enough, starts to rot. Because pretending eventually costs more than telling the truth. Because at some point, the lie becomes heavier than the silence protecting it. They confessed to the private conversations, the side discussions disguised as care, the group moments where your name became a bonding tool, a shared understanding, something everyone quietly knew, and suddenly everything clicked. The doors that closed without explanation, the people who pulled away without conflict, the support that thinned out while no one ever confronted you directly. The isolation that arrived without an event to point to. It wasn't your imagination. It wasn't your sensitivity. It wasn't instability or overthinking. It was coordination. They created a version of you that could be discussed safely because you weren't there to correct it. A version that made their discomfort feel reasonable. A version that turned envy into responsibility and avoidance into virtue. A version that allowed them to align with each other instead of being accountable to you. And here's the quiet part that stings. You trusted them, not blindly, not naively. You trusted them because you assumed honesty was the baseline. You assumed that if someone smiled at you, it meant the same thing privately as it did publicly. You assumed people addressed issues directly. You weren't wrong for that. You were intact. They used your openness as access, your vulnerability as material. Your humanity as something to be managed instead of respected. While they were busy shaping the story about you, they never noticed what you were actually doing. You were surviving. You were learning how to stay grounded in rooms where the temperature kept dropping. You were regulating yourself without validation. You were trusting your own perception while receiving feedback that didn't match reality. You were learning how to be quiet without disappearing. That's the part they didn't anticipate. They assumed confusion would weaken you. That doubt would make you pliable. That isolation would shrink you into something easier to handle, more agreeable, more careful, more willing to accept whatever version of yourself they handed back. Instead, something else happened. You got clearer. You stopped over-explaining. You stopped chasing understanding from people committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped performing emotional labor for spaces that benefited from your exhaustion. You didn't get louder. You didn't get dramatic. You got precise. And that terrified them, because when someone doesn't react the way the script expects, the script starts to fail. When someone doesn't defend themselves against accusations they were never given, those accusations lose gravity. When someone keeps moving forward without demanding justice, the injustice begins to echo back to its creators. This confession didn't give you power. It revealed the power you already had. And that's where everything truly begins to change. Once the truth surfaced, something else became impossible to ignore. This was never about you doing something wrong. It was about you being something they couldn't manage. Your consistency exposed their contradictions. Your authenticity made their performance feel thin. Your ability to sit with yourself without constant reassurance highlighted their dependence on agreement. And instead of rising to meet that discomfort, they chose a safer option. They managed the discomfort by managing you socially, emotionally, narratively. But narratives require upkeep. They need repetition, consensus, silence from the person being discussed. And without realizing it, you gave them the one thing they depended on most: time. Not because you were weak, but because you were building something they couldn't see. While they were talking about you, you were talking to yourself. You were deciding what you would no longer tolerate. You were learning the difference between explanation and self-erasure. You were shedding the need to be understood by people who never once asked you directly. You were stabilizing internally, while everything around you stayed deliberately vague. That's why the truth arriving now feels different. You don't feel explosive. You don't feel hungry for confrontation. You don't feel the urge to gather everyone in a room and demand accountability. You feel steady. Because the truth didn't change your path, it explained why you stayed on it even when it felt lonely. It didn't heal you. It clarified why healing looked the way it did. It didn't validate you. It confirmed what you already knew but were trained to doubt. And now, quietly, something else is happening. They're unraveling. Not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. Because once a confession exists, it can't be unheard. Once a crack appears in a shared story, everyone feels it. The confidence that once held those narratives together starts to wobble. You can sense it even if you're no longer in those spaces. Conversations hesitate where they used to flow. People pause before repeating what once felt safe to say. The old certainty feels brittle now, like everyone suddenly realizes it depended on pretending you were the problem. What bonded them was never truth. It was avoidance. It was fear. It was the comfort of agreement over the courage of integrity, and you're no longer part of that system. You don't need their apology to be whole. You don't need their explanations to be free. You don't need their regret to validate what you lived through. The truth is moving without your involvement now, and that's the part that proves how far you've come. You're not standing around waiting for justice. You're standing where you are, because you kept going, because you chose clarity over chaos, because you refused to compress yourself just to stay included. This isn't a confrontation phase. It's not even a reckoning. It's orientation, like reaching the top of a long climb and finally seeing the full landscape. You can trace the path now, every moment you blamed yourself, every conversation you replayed, every adjustment you made trying to stabilize something that was never stable to begin with. You weren't adapting because you were flawed. You were adapting because you were adopting, because the environment was distorted. And you were the only one committed to staying honest inside it. That confession didn't just expose what they did. It exposed how much emotional labor you were doing alone. How often you carried coherence in a space that thrived on ambiguity. How hard you worked to stay grounded while the floor kept tilting beneath you. Anyone would have felt disoriented there. Anyone would have questioned themselves. But look at what you didn't lose. You didn't lose your values. You didn't lose your empathy. You didn't lose your sense of self even while it was being reframed without your consent. That matters more than you realize. Because now, as the truth slowly circulates, not loudly, not forcefully, you're seeing a shift. People don't interact with you the same way anymore. Not with dismissal, not with superiority, with recognition. Like they're finally seeing a whole person instead of a version that was handed to them. And the most telling part, you're not rushing to fill the silence. You don't feel the need to clarify timelines, correct misunderstandings, or offer explanations no one asked for when it mattered. The version of you they discussed doesn't live in your body anymore. You outgrew it while they were busy defining it. And that's why you remain unmoved, because you already grieved what those connections were supposed to be. You already survived the loneliness. You already rebuilt trust internally when it wasn't available externally. So when the truth arrives late, it doesn't shake you. It simply closes a loop and releases you from the last traces of self-doubt that never belonged to you in the first place. You're different now in ways that are hard to explain but impossible to undo. Not closed, not hardened, just exact. You don't overshare to create closeness anymore. You don't perform understanding to keep the peace. You don't abandon your own perception just to maintain alignment with a group. You learn something most people never do. Alignment without integrity is just a quieter form of self-erasure. So you move differently. You listen longer. You speak with intention. You trust patterns more than apologies. You let people reveal themselves over time instead of filling in the gaps for them. This isn't cynicism, it's earned discernment, and some people feel it immediately. Conversations with you feel heavier now, not because you're distant, but because you're real. Because there's no longer a version of you available for projection. Some will misinterpret that. They'll call your calm cold, your boundaries distance, your neutrality judgment. But you're not judging, you're observing. You learn the difference the hard way. The truth that finally caught up to you didn't come to pull you back into old dynamics. It came to close the final loop, to release you from the last quiet question that lingered in the background. Was it really that bad? Or was I just wrong about myself? Now you know. What you felt wasn't insecurity. It was a signal. What confused you wasn't your intuition. It was distortion. What exhausted you wasn't sensitivity. It was carrying coherence alone. And now that signal has been confirmed. What you do with that confirmation is where your power shows. You don't weaponize it. You don't turn it into bitterness. You don't shrink people the way they tried to shrink you. You integrate it. You let it deepen your self-trust. You let it sharpen your boundaries. You let it inform who gets access moving forward. You let it become wisdom instead of armor. Because armor is heavy. Wisdom moves freely. There may be moments, quiet ones, where someone tries to reopen the door. They'll test the waters with nostalgia, with softened language, with vague acknowledgments that things weren't handled well. They may want reassurance, or absolution, or relief from the discomfort of what they participated in. You don't owe them any of that, not because you're cruel, but because you already did your part. You don't need to punish anyone. Life is already doing the sorting. People who build connection through distortion eventually have to live inside it. People who avoid directness eventually drown in implication. People who outsource their conscience to a group eventually lose the ability to stand alone. You learned how to stand alone without losing yourself. That's not small. So you keep doing what you've been doing. You choose environments where clarity is normal. You invest in connections that don't require you to disappear to belong. You honor your intuition without needing it to be understood by everyone else. You don't rush forgiveness. You don't cling to resentment. You let time finish what it started. Because the hardest threshold is already behind you, the moment you stop needing external confirmation to trust your own experience. Everything after that is integration. There may never be a scene where everyone acknowledges what happened in unison. There may never be a neat ending where the truth is announced out loud and validated publicly. And surprisingly, that doesn't bother you anymore. Because peace doesn't require consensus. It requires coherence, and you have that now. You know who you are. You know what you lived through. You know why it felt the way it did. The truth didn't arrive to change you. It arrived to free you from questioning yourself. And as you move forward lighter than you've been in years, you don't look back to see who's finally catching up. You don't slow down to make the story easier for anyone else to process. You just keep walking. Not away from the past, but beyond it. And the truth? It doesn't chase. It doesn't beg. It follows at its own pace, quietly correcting the record, one realization at a time. You're already where you were meant to be.